Let's talk about food. For most of human history, food meant having things to eat and having enough of them. It's only recently that having too much of a good thing has become a health issue. That's because increasing body fat is associated with high blood pressure, with low good cholesterol levels, with elevated serum triglycerides, and with type 2 diabetes. Perhaps you've already heard about the increasing number of people developing diabetes. It's all part of what's called the metabolic syndrome. It's a major cause of cardiovascular disease, and it's becoming more and more common. The good news is that diseases like diabetes and coronary artery disease don't appear overnight. That gives us opportunities to delay their onset, or even stop them in their tracks. So here's a little about the basic science of human metabolism, remembering that it's so complex a subject that we're like the blind men studying the elephant. In a nutshell, the macronutrients we ingest are the source of the fuel we use to digest food and power our muscles and run our internal machinery. Actually, it's this last task that uses up nearly 2/3 of the fuel. The speed at which we burn through it is called our resting metabolic rate, or RMR. RMR varies with our size. The taller or wider we grow, the more energy our bodies consume, even if we're doing nothing. Being a child must also be hard work, because being young takes a lot of energy. As we age, we go from a full boil to a slow simmer. Of course, a look around can convince anyone that there's lots of individual variation in all of this. Clearly, the Greg Louganeses of the world age differently than do the Marlon Brandos. Some of this is genetics. If we look at the Pima Indians in Arizona, for example, we find that they have a higher incidence of obesity than is present in their non-Native American neighbors. Not surprisingly, they also have a higher incidence of diabetes. But there are also Pima Indians in Mexico who have the same genes, but have a much lower incidence of obesity and diabetes. The difference seems to be related to lifestyle, which probably also explains some of the differences we see in the photographs of the Arizona Pima taken 100 years ago and today. The amount of food, we take in every day can vary, and our metabolism has evolved to accommodate this reality. We learned this by studying rats, who, after all, have about 90% of the same genes that we do. Here are some of the fun things that we can do with rats. We can overfeed them or underfeed them. And guess what? They gain or lose weight just like we do. When we put them back on their usual diet, their weight returns to its usual trajectory. Now, if you're living during an ice age when food is scarce, this turns out to be a handy trick. Have less to eat? Your body adjusts to meager rations by reducing its resting metabolic rate. So why doesn't my weight behave like these overfed rodents? The answer is because we didn't give our rats any chocolate. It turns out that, like us, rats really like chocolate. So to get pudgy rats instead of svelte ones in our experiment, we can just offer our furry friends chocolate-flavored Ensure instead of rat chow. Mammals, it turns out, have something called a hedonic drive. Remember that video on the reward system? And hedonics will override metabolic controls quite reliably. Human beings are particularly adept at creating foods that tickle our hedonic drives fancy, and at creating comestibles unlike anything that our ancestors had. And unlike rats, we know how to work vending machines. There are also some metabolic responses that are uniquely human. For years we've thought that we understand how hormones control weight. So when a special new class of diabetes drugs came along, we expected that people would lose weight. And they did, just not as much as predicted. That's because the people taking the drugs also started eating more, a lot more. That increase in appetite lasted 2 years, which meant that the people ended up regaining a lot of the weight that they had lost. The drug did remove excess sugar from people's bodies, but it also turned on their appetites. Life, as they say, is full of surprises. And finally, one more thing. All animals have food preferences, but most animals eat to obtain what behaviorists call a negative reward. Food functions primarily to take away something that isn't wanted, the unwelcome experience of hunger. But humans, we use food for all sorts of rewards and appetites, even as we stigmatize people who like to eat. In fact, the non-hunger removing issues surrounding food usually predominate in the everyday lives of human beings. Apparently, food and eating represent a particularly challenging labyrinth for us to traverse. Does it even make sense to think that managing weight and nutrition across a lifetime could be possible? We're going to argue that it does, starting in our next video.